When you think about cousin marriage in British history, your first thought is probably the royal family. People like Queen Victoria in 1840 married Prince Albert, her first cousin, and even the late Queen Elizabeth II was third cousin to her husband, Prince Philip. For many people in Britain today, the idea of cousin marriage might be taboo, but historically, cousin marriage wasn't actually that uncommon all throughout Britain and was a normal part of life. For many people today, love is one of the main motivators for getting married, and the concept of romantic love existed in Britain all the way back to medieval times. But maybe more so than today, there was a more general knowledge and acceptance that marriage is a legal and economic contract. According to Dr. Mary Jean Corbett, in Victorian Britain, many communities viewed cousin marriage as a conscious and deliberate strategy to advance shared interests. For many, marriage was about money and power. But how common was cousin marriage? Cousin marriage became an interest to scientists by the late 1800s as they began using their understanding of biological inheritance to investigate matters of health and mental constitution. One of the early attempts to systematically measure cousin marriage came in the late 1860s, when some members of the British Parliament proposed that the upcoming 1871 census include a column asking if couples were related to their spouse. Unfortunately, the proposal was laughed off the floor, so it never was included, but that certainly would have provided invaluable information for today's genealogists. Later on in 1875, George Darwin, son of Charles Darwin and himself a child of a cousin marriage, sent out a questionnaire to 800 members of the upper and middle classes, asking about first cousin marriages among their close relatives. He only received 181 questionnaires back, but they included information about 3,663 marriages. Of those, about 3%, or 125, were first cousin marriages. But even by 1908, in the Welsh newspaper The Evening Express, a Professor Carl Pearson wrote that there was still a lack of data on the subject. While this scientific interest was broadly about health, the movement around cousin marriage in the late 1800s was specifically focused on the asylums. Scientists looked to explain why disabled people in the asylums existed, and some believed that studying cousin marriages would provide the answer. If the theory proved true, they believed that they could ban cousin marriage, which would then eliminate disabled people and the need for the asylums. Scientists now know that this line of thinking is incorrect, as the kinds of disabilities that may manifest in the children of cousin marriages, called recessively inherited single-gene disorders, are not the kind of disabilities that were generally found in the asylums. Biological inheritance is more complex than the Victorians understood, and disability is a natural variation of human existence, so these Victorian scientists were even wrong in their basic assumption that disabled people were a problem to be solved. But even with the Victorians' interest in cousin marriage, we still don't really know how common it was. But if you look at your own family tree, chances are you'll find at least one example. Where you'll most frequently find cousin marriage is among socially isolated communities. So in the context of 18th and early 19th century Wales, who might be considered socially isolated? One group would be people of nonconformist religious denominations. They were called nonconformist because they didn't conform to the Church of England, which was the dominant religious denomination in Wales and England at that time. Because they were marginalized, many of the normal avenues for reaching positions of wealth and power in society were blocked. So one of the ways that you consolidated wealth and power was through repeated cousin marriage. In that way, you reduce the number of descendants who might split the inheritance, and you maximize the number of close relations that you have, which is especially helpful if all of those multiply related cousins hold important positions in a certain industry or sector of society. So let's look at the cousin marriage family tree of one of those nonconformist families. It starts at the top with the Reverend John Jones and his wife Margaret, who were born in 1640 and 1631 respectively, and it goes all the way down to their 6 times great-granddaughter, Mary Emma Davis, who was born in 1878. So far, based on my research on this family, I've found 14 instances of cousin marriage. And if you look at Sarah Davis here, you can see that 4 of her children married their cousins. And that's out of a total of her 7 children who lived to adulthood. So what's going on here? Well, the Reverend John Jones at the top was actually an early Puritan minister, and an important figure in the history of religion in southwest Wales. His legacy continued down the generation, and you find that many of his descendants ended up as Presbyterians, Wesleyan Methodists, and Independents. And this is a major part of their social isolation. In Reverend John Jones' time, it was actually illegal for him to be preaching his beliefs, and he was persecuted because of it. Many times he ended up arrested, and he feared physical violence from his neighbors and strangers alike. He actually ended up receiving a letter in 1672 from King James II, granting him special permission to minister out of his house, thanks to his son who was a captain in the king's army. That kind of persecution leads to a narrowing of the possible pool of marriage candidates. But their religion was also important when it came to accessing things like higher education. They were already a well-off family in the 1600s, so normally they would have sent some of their sons off to get a university education. However, nonconformists, as well as Roman Catholics and Jewish people, couldn't attend most colleges because they couldn't pass the required Church of England religious tests to graduate. These religious tests weren't even fully abolished until 1871 with the University Tests Act. Remember that by 1851, over 80% of the Welsh population that attended church on Sunday went to a nonconformist chapel. One of the solutions to this lack of access to education for nonconformists, and for this family in particular, was to open their own schools and seminaries, many of which were run and attended by people who were related by blood and marriage. Another benefit of cousin marriage for landowning families is that it helped keep wealth generated by their land in the family. So let's look at one specific property called Velindre in the parish of Pencarreg. This property was owned by the Reverend Timothy Davis, and after his death it was split into 2 properties, Upper and Lower Velindre. Lower Velindre was inherited down the line of his daughter Mary, then to her son Timothy, and it's where his children grew up, including his daughter Mary. Upper Velindre passed down the line of Reverend Timothy Davis's son Jonathan, to his son Timothy, then to his son Jonathan. This Jonathan of Upper Velindre married Mary of Lower Velindre, second cousins, and their children grew up at Upper Velindre. So while Reverend Timothy Davis's daughter Mary and her descendants didn't inherit Upper Velindre, down the line her great-grandchildren still got to benefit from that same property thanks to a cousin marriage. So if you're working on your family tree, what does all this history mean to you? 1. It means that you need to be researching your ancestors' spouses and their families because it may turn out that they're also your family. 2. If your ancestor owned land, make sure that you're researching the people who lived there before and after them, because they may also be related by blood or marriage. 3. The people who your ancestors married are important in ways beyond just that they loved them. When you find out more about your ancestors' spouses and their families, you can learn a lot about your own ancestors' identity or even their aspirations in their community. I anticipate getting some comments on this video about the genetic risks of cousin marriage, but according to Drs. Alison Shaw and Aviad Raz, the general public has an exaggerated understanding of the actual risk of cousin marriage, often associated with alarmist and sensationalized media coverage. What you often see is that cousin marriage doubles the risk of serious complications during pregnancy, which isn't great. But in context, it's about the same amount of risk as becoming pregnant after 35 years old, which is certainly something our ancestors did all the time and something that continues today. But even so, some of you watching may be feeling the ick around this topic, and that's okay. What I think it really shows is how the concept of family changes over time, how we view who is close family and who isn't, and who is and isn't marriageable is a product of culture and history. Some of the ick also stems from that misinformation around risk and mixed with the moral panic around disability going all the way back to those Victorian scientists. In many places today, cousin marriage is still very common, and in others, cousin marriage is banned. Just remember to be kind in the comments. Lead with curiosity. Let me know if you found any cousin marriages in your own family tree, because we all have them. And if you want more people to learn about Welsh history and genealogy, you can leave a like so that YouTube knows to share the video. Now go and check out this other video on how our Welsh Victorian ancestors traveled.